Okay, good afternoon to those in Washington, good morning to those in Alaska, good whatever to those around the world. I gather there are 650 people interested in this program, and one of our senators is about to sit down. I'm looking at her ceiling at the moment, but I know it's going to happen, and I don't want to introduce her while we're looking at her ceiling. I'm Jane Harman, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, former long-term member of Congress, huge admirer of both of our speakers, one of whom is speaking now and the other of whom will speak at 4:30, so I understand. This is a virtual Wilson Center event. Our Polar Institute is hosting both senators from Alaska who are admired and close friends of the Wilson Center and me, and who have played key roles in advancing U.S. national security efforts in the Arctic. Senator Lisa Murkowski, whom you can see, and Senator Dan Sullivan, to arrive at 4:30 Eastern Time, have an unmatched, let me say this again, unmatched depth and breadth of experience, understanding, and legislation on Arctic issues, from national security to indigenous communities, scientific research, economic development, and more. The best part is they're kind enough to share that wisdom with us and with the 650 people on this call. They've both spoken at the center multiple times, in person and virtually, and including at our 2017 Arctic Circle Forum and our 2019 Ice Diminished Arctic Symposium. When I introduce events at our Polar Institute, it's become something of a ritual to tell the story of Alice Rogoff, a huge supporter, I think everyone on the call knows this, of Arctic issues and of the Wilson Center, who came to see me about 4 or 5 years ago and said, Jane, are you aware there's a new ocean? And so, of course, Jane, the clueless former member of Congress from Los Angeles, said, what ocean? Of course, it was the Arctic Ocean. And now I know not all about it, but enough about it to realize that we are so fortunate that Alice said that, and that Alice helped to start our Polar Institute, and that Mike Sfraga came to lead our Polar Institute, and that Lisa Murkowski and Dan Sullivan lend so much grace and wisdom to our Polar Institute. So today we are discussing the military dimension of the Arctic, and specifically the U.S. Air Force's first ever Arctic strategy document. Building on the Department of Defense's 2019 Arctic strategy and the 2018 National Defense Strategy, the document calls for improved early warning systems and power projection, as well as greater cooperation with allies and training of soldiers. And it exists in part thanks to the tireless advocacy of today's speaker. And before I give away too many details, I'd much rather turn the floor over to Mike Sfraga, our Polar Institute's fearless leader, who will introduce the senators more thoroughly and moderate the discussion. But I do want to say to Lisa, whom I'm looking at, there she is, thank you for your talent. Thank you for your bravery. Thank you for your unflinching attention to the Wilson Center. Thank you for your friendship. Just so you know, although working in the Senate these days may be a little frustrating, you have a huge fan club out there, and I am certainly a member. So now over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Jane, very much, and thanks for taking the time to introduce this. Senator, thank you so much for dashing from one thing to another to join us today on this important issue. We very much appreciate it, as always. I don't know that we need much introduction for Senator Murkowski, aside to say that she has certainly served the state of Alaska so very well, but she serves our nation in an incredible capacities across the board, everything from energy and resources to the Arctic portfolio, not just for the United States, but thinking more broadly about the circumpolar north. As Jane mentioned, today's focus will be on the Air Force's new Arctic strategy as it relates to the United States, the state of Alaska, implications for the state of Alaska, also though for the North American Arctic, this arc of the Arctic, and even on the other side of the Atlantic, thinking about our friends in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and other allies throughout Europe. But for this discussion, Senator Murkowski, thank you for joining us, because I think it's important to put into perspective the Air Force's new strategy, which is for the Air Force and Space Force, its unique role for the United States, and then, so I'd like your perspectives on those, but also the filter through which perhaps we as Alaskans look through it. What does this mean for Alaska? What is our position vis-a-vis the new North, this new global Arctic? And I have a few things, but maybe we can just start on that on-ramp of concept in terms of the Arctic strategy for the Air Force, what it means for our country, and then perhaps an insight into the Alaska lens on that. And once again, Senator, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, Mike, thank you for the introduction. And to Jane, know that I so greatly appreciate your advocacy there at the Wilson Center, what you have built and Mike have built with the Polar Institute there at Wilson Center is not only important, it is an Arctic imperative. And I thank you for that. Mike, your guidance since you've been there has been fabulous. I always feel like we lose great Alaskans when we call them back to Washington, D.C., but your mission is so important for Alaska, for the Arctic, and really for the world. We greatly appreciate it. But Jane, thank you. Thank you for all you've done for Wilson Center. So to talk about today's issue, the Air Force Arctic strategy, Alaska, the new Arctic, how it all knits together. I will tell you, I was pleased with the Air Force Arctic strategy. I had an opportunity, I've had two opportunities to be with the Secretary of the Air Force, Barbara Barrett, when she has gone to Alaska. And I will tell you, the first trip that we made up there was the weekend that effectively everything was shut down due to COVID. And so the trip to Utqiagvik was truncated, didn't happen until several months later, 6 months later. But it was important. It is important for the Secretary to have seen for herself the U.S. Arctic, and she wanted to do it in the wintertime, which I applaud her for. I will share that as we speak, I'm feeling a little bit reminiscent and homesick, because it was just about this time period that many of us were going to be gathering for the Arctic Encounter in Seattle. Just in a couple weeks from now, we would have been gathered in Reykjavik for the Arctic Circle Assembly. We were supposed to have had a meeting of the Standing Committee of the Arctic Parliamentarians in early September. The opening of the Nook Councilate, the ribbon cutting, if you will, is supposed to take place in a couple weeks here. All these have been delayed or postponed or canceled due to COVID. And this is the first conversation that I've had now in a couple months about the Arctic. And so I thank you for the invitation to get refocused, because there's so much that's going on. So let's start with this Arctic strategy. You know, when you think about it from a policy document and what they outline with their lines of effort, vigilance, power projection, cooperation, preparation, they all sound like the appropriate buzzwords that you want to have in any form of a strategy. But I'm encouraged by this Arctic strategy, because not only does it recognize the importance of the Arctic, but it emphasizes Alaska's role in how we project the national power and the protection of our homeland. And so when you get more specific to Alaska itself and the role that we play, again, the concentration that we have of 5th gen fighters there in Alaska, between J-Bear and Eielson, what we are putting what we already have in place in terms of the early warning and detection, everything from Cobra Dane to the assets that are being built out at Clear with a long-range discrimination radar, the power projection that we have there at Fort Greely. Alaska is truly front and center, if you will, with that. So we have long recognized the strategic role that Alaska plays. We've long recognized that an Arctic strategy has to be key, but it seems to me that what we're seeing now is we're going beyond just the awareness, the talking about it stage, to the actual action and implementation. And I think that is particularly key as we look to this strategy. A recognition that on the communications aspect, how we are working with Air Force, Space Force, but all forms of communication, again, to focus on that preparation. What the strategy details in terms of strategic alliances, again, I think is a reminder for us in Alaska. Oftentimes we're viewed as, yes, everyone knows we're part of the United States, but sometimes we're viewed as our own Arctic country. And Alaska on its own has very specific alliances with other Arctic nations. How we then build on that to help facilitate the connectedness with the United States and other Arctic nations. And then two more points, and I'll turn it over to you, Mike, but the focus on the training in an Arctic environment. From the perspective of one who has long been an advocate of Alaska's cold weather training, recognizing that not all wars are going to be fought in deserts, making sure that we have a level of expertise that is built up for search and rescue operations for Arctic environments. The training has got to be an important aspect of the strategy here. And I think that the Air Force strategy keys in on that in a significant way. And then the last part, and I have applauded this in several different commentaries, and that is this Air Force Arctic strategy is the first one, to my knowledge, that highlights that it is the Indigenous people who reside in the Arctic communities that have the knowledge, that have the skills about the region to help us, whether it is to help the Air Force, to help Space Command, to help better understand the Arctic environment. And so a very special, I think, thanks and appreciation to the Air Force and Secretary Barrett for the inclusion and highlighting the Indigenous communities and harnessing their knowledge to enrich the exercises for the military and our allied partners, but how they intersect with this very global effort, I think is a key part of what is new in this strategy.
Thank you, Senator. You mentioned the opening of the consulate in Nuuk. I know you were obviously a big proponent of that, but that stretches us now from Alaska, Northern Canada to Greenland. Can you talk for a moment about that, the North American Arctic, through a couple of lenses? One would be the Air Force's strategy and how we are linked in that strategy. It's very explicit, leveraging NORAD and other assets. And the second would be just that. Can you just share some thoughts about the North American Arctic? We often look at the Arctic north-south or south-north.
Right.
But to those of us who live here, we have a different orientation sometime, which is east-west or west-east. So in terms of the Air Force's strategy, it does look at that sort of arc of North America. So maybe you could talk a little bit about those military connections, but beyond that, the people's connections between and within the North American Arctic.
Well, I think we clearly have seen, when you think about those alliances in the Arctic, what the United States has had with Greenland for quite some time, with the establishment at Thule Air Force Base there, that has been significant from an alliance perspective in terms of the air power and how that power projection is really outlined and defined. And so I think it's very important to recognize that as a critical component. You mentioned the North American Arctic, and you have heard me say at several different Arctic symposiums that there's really two Arctics. There's the North American Arctic and the Arctic that is really lacking in a lot of the modern infrastructure, everything from roads and communication ability to just simple aspects of commerce and communication. You have the Scandinavian Arctic, where you've got many people, millions of people who are living in that part. You have infrastructure that is developed and sophisticated. You have economies that are strong and robust. And yet you look at the U.S. Arctic in Alaska or in parts of Canada, where basic water and sewer infrastructure are lacking. And so when I think, and we're not talking from a defense posture right now, but just from the perspective of a North American Arctic that is so behind, if you will, in basic infrastructure. So how do you protect, respond, how do you engage in an area where you might not have the runways, where you might not have the telecommunications systems? You know, how again do we meet the four tiers or the four pillars here of their strategy, which is vigilance, power projection, cooperation, and preparation, when you don't have a deep water port in your Arctic yet? You don't have the ability to do resupplies. You have dead zones in your communication. And so I think it's important to understand that you have some significant differences between your North American Arctic and your Scandinavian, but still the commonalities that we have, the alliances, again, that we can build, what we can learn from one another because of our geography is something that shouldn't be overlooked.
Thank you, Senator. We're going to put a lot into this 30 minutes with you. We really appreciate that. And I'm starting to get some questions from those online. But two questions for me, and then I'll open it up to one or two questions from the audience. Mm-hmm. One is, what do you think this Air Force strategy, what signals does the strategy send, right? I mean, there's a narrative, there's a plan, but what signals do you think it sends to allies and like-minded nations and those who don't share our perspectives?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think the signal is an important one. The signal is we're here. We're here, we're stepping up, we're playing, we are engaged. And I think some may say, well, of course that's true. But for many around the Arctic, they have looked at the U.S. involvement in the Arctic, and they've been saying, hey, you know, the U.S. is late to the game. Where are they? Are they, you know, they're not investing in their infrastructure like you're seeing in Russia, for instance. They acknowledge that they have a role as an Arctic nation, but we're not really seeing them put their money where their mouth is. They're starting to see it now, and they've been seeing it, particularly when you look at the role that the Department of Defense has played, and most specifically the Air Force. Again, we talk about our 5th-gen fighters, the infrastructure that is being put into place with regards to just the early warning, the efforts that we are making to send a very strong signal to our Arctic friends and neighbors that we have the eyes on you. We've got the eyes on target. We are eyes on the terrain, and we are eyes in the air and into space. And so I think the strategy that you have seen unveiled is a strong signal that the United States and our Air Force and the Department of Defense is a real player in the Arctic. I like to remind folks, though, that the Arctic strategy and Arctic strategy is not just a military strategy, that there are other component pieces to it, and you and I recognize that. That's why I was pleased to see the Secretary acknowledge the Indigenous peoples, because we can't just act like there's nobody up there and you could just do all this in a vacuum. We have to, if we're smart, incorporate the understanding that we've seen develop there over thousands and thousands of years. But it is beyond just the military and the defense posture. It is from an environmental perspective. It is from a resource development perspective. It is a commercial perspective with levels of commerce coming through as we're seeing the sea lanes open. And so this is a very integral piece in this bigger picture that we are building with regards to the U.S. role in the Arctic.
Thank you. That leads me to ask the second part of this, this balance between competition and cooperation.
Right.
I won't go on the long narrative. We all know that. But now we see that perhaps there's a bit more on the competition side that maybe is rising to the level of so much of the cooperation that has been happening. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that through the lens of our shared border with the Russian Federation and the recent naval operations that the Russian Federation performed just a couple of weeks ago, and the potential for a conflict there with our fishing fleets that are allowed to go 200 miles in the EEZ, as the Russian Federation has the right to navigate international waters. But that's the thing that has worried most of us as we talk about the competition, is to have a misread of something that's happening right off our own coast. Could you give us your thoughts and your perspectives on that?
No, that is absolutely a fair concern. And again, when I mentioned earlier the numerous Arctic conferences that typically would be going on at these times, those are all designed, in my view, to help build those alliances and those relationships so that when there are times of conflict, we can say, whoa, wait a minute. I better go talk. I need to go talk at the Arctic Coast Guard Forum because we've got an issue here with the Russians and we need to be dealing with this. And you will have established these relationships. And that's where, when I said just a moment ago, that not only when we're talking about an Arctic strategy do we need to focus on a military Arctic strategy, but we need, not all of the solutions are going to be military solutions. And so what more we can do to enhance and build upon our participation in these international organizations like the Arctic Council, the Arctic Assembly, again, the Arctic parliamentarians. I mentioned the Arctic Coast Guard Forum and what they can help to do to, again, build out stronger relationships, but making sure that we've got these partners in the Arctic for the whole host of reasons that we may need, whether it's search and rescue, whether it's oil spill response, whether it's environmental protection, scientific research, monitoring. We all know what, the changes that we're seeing with fisheries that are moving and migrating northwards. So having this level of cooperation through our agencies and our allies and our partners is key. You mentioned the incident in the Bering Sea with our fishermen lawfully out in this area, and Russia allowed to do these exercises. But again, was the communication what it needed to be at the time? Well, it clearly wasn't when you have United States fishing vessels who believe that they have been threatened, that their safety has been compromised unless they move off of the fishing grounds. So how we work to facilitate that these are clearly defined, that they are understood, and that they are respected has got to be key moving forward, because we all say we want the Arctic to be a zone of peace. Well, peace comes about when you have a healthy respect for one another, based on a level of cooperation. But sometimes it's that competition that advertently or perhaps inadvertently creates a level of tension that blows up that cooperation.
Thank you for that. And I am watching the clock diligently because I know you have many other things to get to. But my colleague, Gabe Denmark from the Wilson Center, asks an interesting question, or at least ask you for your thoughts on this. Alaska is seen mostly, we're so geostrategic, but the mindset might be the circumpolar north, obviously, as it should be. But you know, two administrations have said that also Asia is very strategic. The Pacific Rim, China, Asian countries, Indo-Pacific, and we're all tied into that, right? The Indo-Pacific all the way through the Bering. So his question really comes down to, what do you think we should be doing to strengthen and diversify our military posture in Alaska, vis-a-vis Alaska's role to not only look north, but perhaps also elsewhere on the Asia side of the globe as well?
Well, it's a good question. It's a fair question, and it's one that I think our military leaders are keenly focused on. I think one of the natural areas that we need to look is what are we lacking right now in Alaska when it comes to our ability to really respond not only northward but to the south as well. And I mentioned the complement that we have with our F-35s, our F-22s, our 5th gen fighters there. We're in a pretty extraordinary place where we can be just about to any hot spot in the world more readily than other places in the United States. But one capacity that we lack right now is the ability to refuel in the air these assets. And so this is something that Senator Sullivan and I have been working and advocating with the Air Force in terms of placement of KC-46s. I think that would be an important part of making sure that we have the ability to respond in air, timely, anywhere. I think that is key. I do recognize that we do have a tendency to be thinking about just that quarter of the globe that surrounds us. But again, recognizing the geostrategic reach that Alaska has compared, again, to U.S. facilities elsewhere. This is an asset that I don't think that we can overstate when we take into account our training opportunities and again our ability to move out as quickly as anyone in the globe. We're getting kind of tired of Billy Mitchell's saying, but it just holds true. We hold the world because of our location.
So speaking of that, and again, I am watching the clock for your time. Speaking of that, I've used the phrase, correctly or not, there's been a quickening in maybe understanding, action. There's a quickening in the Arctic across all facets of the Arctic. But it seems like the Department of Defense, they got it a while ago, but it seems like the Department of Defense, the Air Force, other branches of our military get it and are starting to actionalize this quickening of the Arctic, the realization. Is that your sense as well?
It absolutely is, and I like the use of the word there because that's really what it feels like. There is a momentum here, and look to some of the specifics that we've seen just recently coming out of the administration and Department of Defense. You know, I mentioned we were just talking about the opening of the consulate there in Nuuk in Greenland. You had a presidential memorandum not too many months ago on the Arctic. That's significant. The focus on a fleet of icebreakers. You have the appointment of Jim DeHart as the U.S. coordinator for the Arctic region. So you've got things that are happening administratively. On the appropriation side, you look to where we're actually putting hard dollars, because you and I both know you can talk a lot about a good hard strategy, but if you don't put something behind it, it's just words on paper. Well, what is happening with the build out of the first polar security cutter with a second one coming online, the effort to ensure that we're going to have a deep water port in the region, in Nome, that's moving forward. There's dollars that are being put behind that infrastructure. When you think about the funding that is coming to the Arctic and the military construction dollars, what you've seen over the past 5 years has been pretty unprecedented in terms of how much we've seen and the build out within our state. Those are commitments to hard dollars from DOD, and then working with the administration and Congress. We are moving beyond just the talk to the action. It is a quickening.
And I guess the final thing is to put this in context. About 80% of DOD's assets are through the Air Force. So we have a significant, robust Air Force presence, Space Force presence. I see that the strategy amplifies that, but there's a larger part to DOD, obviously, and we see some increases in effort and spending there as well. It seems like it's a nice tiered effect, a nice tiered strategy. I would just ask you this one last question, Senator, and that is, how do we leverage this interest and investment in our state through the military, perhaps through DHS and others? How do you leverage this for Alaska? Because there are dual uses, there are multiple uses. Investments do have ripples and leverages. I know that we don't want to go down to detail, but how best do you see that kind of informed leveraging of shared infrastructure and shared assets in the state?
Well, I'll give you two very key examples. One is one that I just mentioned. We're moving forward finally on a deep water port in Nome. That will be infrastructure that will not only be able to accommodate a larger vessel coming in, but provisioning, but what it does is it helps lower the overall costs within the region, because you have commercial vessels that can come in, and we know the benefit of a port. But let's talk about it from the perspective of communications, because this Arctic strategy really does focus on the communications aspect and a whole communications plan. And that plan is not just, we're talking big about, we're gonna move forward on broadband. This is everything. This is talking about, how we're going to be able to utilize satellites, how we're going to really be able to link up the Arctic. From a defense perspective, that's obviously got to be a key priority. But think about what that means. If you're in Point Hope, for instance, to know that you are going to be a community now that will have access to reliable, more affordable communications through satellite, that you are able to have your whole school on virtual learning, if that's what they need to be doing, because now you have the ability to do that. Because right now, what we're seeing in way too many parts of our state, as we know, is our kids, for them, distance learning is something nice to talk about, but they simply don't have capacity out there. So you're talking about something that will not only benefit our military, but you are talking about bringing Alaskans into this century when it comes to their ability to be connected to others. This is, I think, the potential for just transformational opportunities for us.
Senator, thank you. Whenever the Wilson calls, you always answer the phone or the Zoom. So I want to just thank you for taking so much of your time today in the midst of everything else you're doing to talk with us a little bit about not just the Air Force's strategy, which really is, for the United States, a big deal, for the state of Alaska, a big deal, for the North American Arctic, a big deal. but also to then broaden out that perspective beyond the Air Force, but leveraging strategies coming out of the federal government. And as always, it's just great to hear your perspectives, your insight, and your thoughts on this. So I want to thank you again for spending 35 minutes. I apologize for the 5 minutes over with us. And we look forward to the very next time. It's just always a pleasure.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you for your passion and advocacy for all things Arctic. Our hearts are in the same place.
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay. And for those also watching, thanks again to Senator Murkowski, and we have Senator Sullivan now coming online. So if you just have some patience with us for a moment, we'll bring in Senator Sullivan there's Senator Sullivan. Senator, thank you so much.
Hey, how are you? Nice to see you.
Well, I'm fine, Senator. I'm in Fairbanks, and
oh, you're in
you
Fairbanks.
Apparently are not. Yeah, there
Good.
you go. Yeah, well, thank you so much.
I just got off the plane. I was home over the weekend and took the red eye, so I landed in DC about 4 hours ago and got to run in. And so if I'm looking a little tired, it's so many Alaskans are used to it, but the red eye was what I was on last night or this morning or whatever time of day.
Whatever it was. Well, Senator, thank you. You look no worse for the wear. We appreciate you coming all the way from Alaska back to DC and getting a run in and then joining us. I know that you've got more than enough on your plate. We just always appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, especially about the topic today, right?
Yes.
The new Air Force strategy that impacts the Air Force and the Space Force. And so I know we've got about 30 minutes, but let me once again sincerely thank you for taking the time, knowing full well what you've gone through. So maybe we'll just get to it because we only got about 30 minutes or so, if that's okay with you.
Yeah. Right.
The new Air Force strategy, as we were just talking, is a significant strategy in and of itself. It also sends a lot of messages. So I know we've got about 650 people who RSVP'd for this around the globe. And I think they would be very interested, Senator, in your perspective on the Air Force's new Arctic strategy as rolled out by Secretary Barrett.
Yeah, so first, Mike, let me thank you, right? You've been a great advocate in the Wilson Center. I know Congresswoman Harman's on, and you guys are doing a great job. So whether you're doing it from Fairbanks or DC, we each really appreciate the advocacy and the education. I think, look, I think we're at an inflection point in some ways a positive way with regard to Arctic strategy, interest in the Arctic. I think you've seen Senator Murkowski and I working very closely together on these issues. I will say, though, that the progress that we've seen, at least in my time here, the last 5.5 years in the U.S. Senate, has been very substantial. And I'll just give you an example with regard to the strategies. Not to kind of go too far in the background or kind of looking in the rearview mirror, but as you know, the previous administration's DoD strategy was not a serious strategy at all. I had early on when I was here, I held it up with Secretary Ash Carter, who I happen to like, President Obama's Secretary of Defense, but he knew it. We all knew it. It was pretty much a joke. And I slammed it on the dais in a hearing, very angry, right? Because there's so much going on, and yet the Department of Defense, and by the way, this is bipartisan criticism, in my view, has been the slowest to recognize America's strategic national security, economic security, energy security, environmental security interests, and yet has the most at stake. So to me, when I got here, the biggest thing I was focused on, particularly being on the Armed Services Committee, is getting the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, to wake up to this challenge. My view is they're not there yet. They're getting there. And what we've been doing, particularly on the Armed Services Committee, as you know, is we've been putting in mandates that require the Department of Defense to put together serious strategies, not little ones, but serious classified, unclassified strategies. So you saw the end of the Obama administration, beginning of the Trump administration, the Pentagon finally put out a serious classified and then unclassified strategy that was focused on our national security interests, focused on the challenges, particularly posed by Russia and China. And then what we've been encouraging is the different services to then undertake their own strategies. And that's starting to happen. And, you know, Mike, one of the things that's a great, the way I see it as a great opportunity and part of my job is to bring these leaders to Alaska, because we sell ourselves. They get to our state and they're like, whoa, strategic, important, community loves the military, which actually really matters when they're looking at placing forces in our state. You want to be in a place that wants you. That's human nature. Believe it or not, not every state in America wants military forces. I know that's kind of a foreign concept to Alaskans, but it does happen in other states. So you're starting to see these different strategies. The Coast Guard put out an Arctic strategy, and now the Secretary of the Air Force did. You may have seen, I hosted her, Senator Murkowski and I hosted Secretary Barrett about 6 weeks ago in Alaska. It was a great trip. She and I got all over the state, up to Utqiagvik, out to Kotzebue. And then just 2 weeks ago, I had the Secretary of the Navy in Alaska, and he got all over the state. We were in J-Bear, Ketchikan. He went out to Adak. He was stationed in Adak as a naval aviator, so he gets it. He gets us. By the way, a former ambassador in Norway, too, so he gets the Arctic. He went to Kodiak. I can talk about that trip. But to your question, I think it's a very robust strategy. It's not perfect, but it certainly highlights the importance of Alaska. But it highlights the importance of the Arctic as a national security imperative for the Air Force. One of the things that's, you're starting to see it in testimony, it used to be kind of a classified concept, but the Air Force strategy clearly highlights this, is, and General Shaughnessy was really highlighting this as the NORTHCOM commander. You know, in the avenue of approach to the entire country in terms of cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles, threats to our nation, not just to the Arctic, but to the entire United States of America, exists through the Arctic. So we're starting to see the recognition and the unclassified discussion of how we are not just an important area of interest because there's great power competition happening in the Arctic now, but to defend the entire homeland, you have to have a robust presence in the Arctic. And we're finally starting to see that. But I thought the Secretary did a great job laying out the strategy. I think we're going to see one coming from the Navy here very soon. But to me, it's a sea change from where we were even 5 years ago, where this was kind of a backwater concept in the Pentagon. And now it's really on the front foot of a lot of our senior military officials, and not just military officials. You've probably seen Secretary Pompeo has been very forceful on talking about our strategic interests in the Arctic. And as Senator Murkowski mentioned, the President's memorandum on enhancing our national security in the Arctic, where to home port icebreakers. I'd love to talk about that because that's the whole reason I brought the Secretary of the Navy up to Alaska. We've made huge progress on that issue. So I think the Air Force's strategy, to me, is the most robust, comprehensive, and serious of any of the services. It's going to be a high bar for other services to meet. And I'm quite pleased with it. It's not perfect, but you can't read it and not think that the Air Force is taking our national security interests in the Arctic and the key role that we play, our state plays in that strategy very seriously.
Senator, thank you. I'm also I'm filtering some questions coming in from about. We have, as I might have mentioned, we have about 650 people who have registered to be online. So I have a question that dovetails with what you were just talking about. There's a dovetail into the NDAA in language. So let me ask these two questions. One is, would the U.S. benefit from a single oversight, a single point of contact, a single person within DoD to oversee to oversee Arctic operations. And the second is related to the combatant command structure. It's bifurcated, or it looks like a Venn diagram, right?
Yeah.
Would it benefit? The question basically boils down to two things. One is a single point of contact within DoD or a single authority. The second is, what about the combatant command structure? Would the Arctic benefit from something different?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as a matter of fact, I've had these discussions literally with the Secretary of Defense pretty recently, the Secretary of the Air Force, the Navy, Secretary of the Navy, all just probably in the last few months. So on the combatant command issue, as you know, we're at the classic example of being in the seams of the different combatant commands. And I'm trying to remember, my flight is kicking in, so I can't fully remember, but there was this famous Napoleon statement saying, where do the battles always take place? It's where the two maps come together, so it's always the most complicated. But if you look at where we are in Alaska, now I think it has to do with our strategic location, but our forces are essentially under the operational command of PACOM. We are part, so that's the combatant command, the Pacific Command. And yet we are geographically part of NORTHCOM. And our primary threat, certainly right now, in terms of the Arctic, and we saw it just a couple weeks ago, is Russia, and that's EUCOM. That's European Command. And of course, we play a critical role. We're the cornerstone of missile defense for the entire nation. Alaska is, with our radar, with our ground-based missile interceptors. That's actually more focused on STRATCOM, the Strategic Command. So right there, I just named 4 different combatant commands that are kind of at the seams of where we are in the Arctic and just in Alaska. So it can cause confusion, there's no doubt about it. It can cause kind of, hey, who's actually really responsible for these issues? And so I've been an advocate for, at least at the DAS, the Deputy Assistant Secretary level in the Pentagon, I've been pushing this in the NDAA to have a DAS, Department of Defense Deputy Assistant Secretary just in charge of the Arctic. And we're making progress on that in this NDAA. And then you saw, and Senator Murkowski mentioned it, that the State Department just did that as well. So I think it's actually a really important question. I actually think it just demonstrates how strategically important we are. But when you have so many combatant command literally coming together where Alaska is, it creates confusion, and it kind of can create a bit of a strategic sinkhole where people aren't thinking about it really at the front of their minds.
Thank you. If it's all right with you, I'm going to just keep going to these great questions that are coming in, because it's overlapping a lot of the issues that you've brought up, and it certainly has been keyed off the Arctic strategy from the Air Force. The question, and I'll try to get as many here. Question is, Senator, do you think the Russian interests in the U.S. military buildup in Alaska, the 5th gen, clear, missile defense, on and on, is that why we see an increase in the number of U.S. intercepts of Russian aircraft off Alaska's coast? Or are those just multiple intercepts, just business as usual? So in other words, is this a ratcheting up?
No, I'm Mike. And by the way, to my last question, we did get that DAS-D position in the Pentagon in the NDAA this year. So the NDAA that passed, the Senate has that. So we think that's progress to the question that was just presented. No, there's a clear ratcheting up, and I don't think this is business as usual at all. And I think that when you look at the new national defense strategy and national security strategy, which doesn't get a lot of attention, but in my view, it should, because this is a really, really bipartisan document. The vast majority of senators, whether they're Republicans or Democrats in the U.S. Senate, who focus on national security issues, think that the national security strategy by the Trump administration and the national defense strategy, in particular that Secretary Mattis put together, are very well-written, well-reasoned, serious documents. What they did, and we just celebrated the 19th anniversary or commemoration of 9/11, but these documents essentially said, look, post 9/11, we were focused on the threat of violent extremist organizations, particularly them getting weapons of mass destruction. That was viewed as the principal threat to the United States of America and our citizens. Very much, I think, appropriate post 9/11. That's still certainly a threat. There's no doubt. We can't take our eye off that ball. But one of the good news pieces when you look back on the time since 9/11, 19 years ago, is that we've diminished that threat thanks to the brave men and women in our military who, whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda or even the Quds Force in Soleimani with the Iranians, that threat has been diminished, and a lot of the leadership of those organizations have been killed by our brave military members. The new national defense strategy says we have to continue to focus on that, but the real pacing challenge for the next 50 to 100 years in the United States is the return of great power competition between near peer or peer adversaries like Russia and China. So I think to your question, there's no doubt in my mind that the great power competition that is predicted and pretty much happening right now has arrived in the Arctic. The Russians are very open and transparent about what they see as this sphere of influence for them, how they see it critical, not just to their national security, but their economic security, how Putin has called the Northwest Passage the new Suez Canal. They're gonna, according to him, they're gonna control it, own it. And so they have a very clear, articulated strategy. The Chinese, as you know, are now starting to do something similar. So I think what we saw just in the last 3 weeks, I'm not sure I would predict it as the new normal, because it was a really big escalation. I got the classified briefing on what happened, but the unclassified discussions that are out in the press, they had 6 Bear bomber runs at us at the same time. Unprecedented. That's unprecedented. All the way from Utqiagvik down to Kodiak, and we were scrambling, several F-22s to go get them, to go intercept them. And that's not, we do it, our men and women are so professional, they make it look easy. That's not an easy operation. Those are dangerous operations. And at the same time, we had to launch several sections of F-22s to go intercept. Meanwhile, the Russian naval exercises, which were huge, and harassing our fishermen within our exclusive economic zone, was a whole new level of, I think, provocation. So to me, what we need to be doing, and we're finally doing it, and I think this is part of your advocacy and our advocacy in the Congress, is I've always believed that weakness is provocative, and when you are weak in a certain area, and we've been weak in the Arctic, you're going to have the great power competition kind of probe. Now that we are building up our military, building up our Coast Guard, building up our F-35 capability, getting icebreakers, I think that's a whole another topic that we're finally building them. I've been really, really strongly pushing the entire administration, Trump administration, on making sure the decisions where those are going to be home ported, they should at least be home ported, some of them in Alaska. That's why I had the Secretary of the Navy in Alaska 2 weeks ago. The whole point was, Mr. Secretary, where else would you put icebreakers to protect America's national security interests? Florida, right? But I think it's a ratcheting up that we might see as more regular, and we need to be able to confront it and protect our interest here. With the F-35s coming, with the F-35s coming, Eielson will have over, the F-22s at Jaber, F-35s at Eielson will have over 100 fifth-generation fighters located in Alaska, over 100. No place on the planet Earth has 100 5th gen. Those are supersonic stealth fighters. And I'm hopeful, and we've been working this, I've been working this one for years. You get those co-located with the KC-46 being hopefully located in Alaska. What the Secretary of Defense said in his confirmation hearing when I asked him, what kind of message would it send our adversaries anywhere and around the world, but particularly in the Arctic, if you had 100 5th gen fighters co-located with the new air refueling tanker? And he said, Senator, that would show to our adversaries and potential adversaries, particularly if they were located in Alaska, that Alaska and America have extreme strategic reach. So but it's important that we continue to work on this.
Thank you, Senator. I'm mindful of your time, so I'm watching the clock. But you have elicited from those watching across the country and abroad a lot of questions. So let me just ask you this next one, a little different, but it's related to the Arctic strategy from the Air Force, because they point out the importance of including Indigenous peoples, traditional knowledge, incorporation of a lot of voices into their strategy. We talked about training, but nevertheless, it highlights Indigenous people. So the question that has come from someone watching us is, some Indigenous people believe that perhaps the Arctic might be becoming too militarized, that great power competition is driving too much of the narrative related to the Arctic. And so how can these concerns be voiced and considered as from a US perspective, but also stretching throughout Northern Canada and even specifically noted into Greenland? So I guess there's the question really is, what's the balance here, and how can Indigenous communities perspectives on the military buildup in our state be balanced as we go forward in this new Arctic?
Well, look, it's a great question, and I will tell you the fact that the Air Force strategy had a focus on and highlighting the importance of working with the Indigenous people of the Arctic is something that let's just say that we had encouraged that when the Air Force was writing that, to not forget that. Having been given a little bit of an update of what was going to be in that, we made sure, and I can tell you that was me and my team, that we said that's a really important component of your strategy. Don't forget that. So we were really glad that they didn't. I will tell you, even with the COVID challenges, and a lot of our communities, some of our rural communities, our Alaska Native communities, are very rightfully concerned about the challenges that the pandemic presents to their communities in terms of health, particularly given the history that we've seen with the Spanish flu and other, tuberculosis that have been so devastating from a health perspective. The Secretary and I actually made this recommendation when she came up. I said, it would be really important to make sure you're meeting with the leadership of any of the communities that you go to that are in the rural communities. So she and I did have the opportunity to meet with the leadership at Utiavik and the leadership of Kotzebue. Those were the two communities that she went to just about 5 weeks ago. So I think that, and Senator Murkowski really touched on this, I think, at least in my perspective, and of course I get out to these communities quite a lot, by and large, they're extremely patriotic. Our Alaska Native communities, they serve at higher rates in the military than any other ethnic group in the country. So the bond with the military in every one of these communities is super strong, just because they have such a really incredible patriotic legacy of service. And so I think that for the most part, at least in my experience, in this latest trip that I took with the Secretary reaffirms this, for the most part, the leadership in many of these communities is very supportive of our military. And I think that's great, and I think that's a long legacy. I think that the challenge with great power competition is, at least in my view, if it's happening and the Russians and the Chinese are in the Arctic and we're not also kind of stepping up our game, it's not as if it's going to go away. I think it could actually be worse. So But here's something, and Senator Murkowski was touching on this, and I really like to emphasize this. The opportunities for Alaska, when you look at the Arctic being recognized as a really important area of interest for America, they extend way, way beyond the military. And Mike, you've talked a lot about this, and I think it's really important to emphasize this. So when I look at these issues, yes, I certainly think we should have more Coast Guard vessels. We should have more icebreakers. And I've been working very hard, not only on the Armed Services Committee, but the Environment and Public Works Committee, deep water Arctic port in Nome, and then a series of ports, whether it's, Port Spencer, Port Clarence and Point Spencer, north of Nome, or Cape Blossom and Kotzebue, a series of ports. And that benefits everybody, way beyond just any kind of national security interest. And then what's the vision to put together more opportunities for our citizens? Senator Murkowski already mentioned I was proud to get the Air Force's NORTHCOM's top recommendation for a low Earth orbit system of polar communications. That's in the NDAA, the first part of that. But that has enormous opportunities and applications for residential and commercial communications for our Native communities, way beyond the military. I'll give you another one. Research with Coast Guard vessels, with icebreakers. You're seeing we're going to get the Fairweather. That's the NOAA ship back home ported in Ketchikan, where it belongs. You have this great opportunity there. And then beyond that, and this is starting to happen, it's very exciting, shipbuilding and ship repair. There's something in the Coast Guard bill right now that would make shipbuilding and ship repair much more accessible in Alaska shipyards for Coast Guard vessels. The Ketchikan shipyard has enormous potential. Seward, you may have seen, just in the last year, has 2 new shipyards. And they're employing well over 100 people. That I went and toured both of them. They're phenomenal facilities. One just got a really good ship maintenance contract with the U.S. Navy. The Secretary of the Navy met with us. This is a company called JAG. So the ramifications way beyond national security to our economic security, our universities. We got in the NDAA this year, the Ted Stevens Center, the DoD Center for the Study of the Arctic, which in my view will go to one of our universities or maybe share between UAA and UAF. These are the spin-off opportunities that can have enormous benefits for Alaskans way beyond national security, which is why this moment is so exciting, because we're not just talking about it anymore. These things are happening. They're happening.
Thank you, Senator. And you beat me to the punch on the question about the Ted Stevens Center. So that's fantastic, because I see, again, for all of the work you've just talked about. So that's great to hear the support there. I have one remaining question. I'm being very mindful of your time. And it goes back to a question asked earlier by my colleague, Abe Denmark, who notes that, the Asia, China, Asia, the Asia area has been far more strategic, at least in narrative and in actual actions for the United States. We've marked Asia as a strategic region for the United States. And the question is, not just on the Arctic strategy for the Air Force, but posture overall. But of course, the Air Force has 80% of the assets from DoD. How does that, give us your thoughts about everything from the Indo-Pacific, Asia, Indo-Pacific, that chain right up through the North Pacific, the Bering, into the Arctic Ocean. There's this strategic place, not just north for Alaska, but also in other regions, strategic and of interest to the United States, including the Asia region. So can you give us your thoughts about that as well?
Sure. No, it's a great question. And it goes back to kind of what I was referring to on the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, which again, one of the kind of untold stories, with regard to our national security is that document the reorientation to this challenge that we have with regard to great power competition is very widely accepted, at least here in the US Senate. The vast majority of my colleagues, whether Democrats or Republicans who focus on national security issues, think that this reorientation is overdue and needed. So that's important because, you know, a lot of times you're reading in the paper and stuff, oh, it's all conflict here. And but on these issues, there's a strong sense of bipartisanship on how we need to reorient. But as you know, Mike, the Arctic, obviously, there's not some demarcation. Well, I guess the Arctic Circle is a demarcation. But the national security and economic security interests don't just stop. To me, the reorientation on great power competition clearly is a reorientation to the Indo-Pacific, but it's the Indo-Pacific with the Arctic essentially being part of it because it's the North Pacific. And whether it's fisheries, whether it's national security, whether it's new transportation routes, they all play into each other. You can't just say, oh, here's one, it stops here, and this one is less important than the other one. They're very integrated. And to me, the fact that we are seeing the great power competition play out literally on a daily basis in the Arctic because of the issues at stake, resources, strategic location, the environment, and of course the people. I'll leave you with one final anecdote that I think demonstrates the progress. When I got here 5.5 years ago, I sat down with the NORTHCOM commander, and he had very little interest in the Arctic. And at one point, he and I had very different views, right? And at one point, he even said, well, and by the way, Senator, there's nobody really up there. And I was like, nobody up there. There's a ton of people up there. They happen to be my constituents. And that attitude has changed dramatically. Nobody's talking like that anymore. The interest on all of these issues, a lot of it's been driven by the Congress. I think the Pentagon has been slow to recognize it, but they're finally coming along. And I think that they all play into this reorientation on great power competition and the integration between the Arctic issues and the Asia Pacific issues, I think are, to me, very apparent. And you can't really separate the two. And our state epitomizes that.
Senator, I'm going to leave that last word to you. I cannot thank you enough for flying all night, getting off a plane, and then coming to speak with all of us for this time, knowing full well you've got many things still on your plate to do today. So thank you very much for your time. You've always been very, very considerate of your time with us. And we hope that we provide this very helpful forum here. But I know, and I apologize to everyone who has written questions because the right side of my screen is full of questions from all over. So I will look forward to doing this again. But thank you very much for your perspectives, your insight, and the work that you're doing on behalf of all of us in the Arctic.
Well, Mike, thank you. You guys are doing a great job. And it's a team effort in these kind of forums of people understanding the issues, recognizing how important they are, not just to Alaskans, but to Americans and to our allies. I think you guys are doing a great job, and the more we're able to do this, make the advocacy, and then, like I said, what I'm really pleased about, we're certainly not there yet, but at least in my time in the Senate, it's a relatively short time, we've moved from talk, a lot of talk on these issues, to action. We are seeing serious action, concrete action, building icebreakers, authorizing ports, bringing F-35s, and as Senator Murkowski's mentioned, we've had about $1.6 billion in military construction in Alaska just in the last 4 years. This is a serious, serious buildup that benefits our economy, no doubt about it, thousands of jobs related to that, but benefits the national security of America. And that, at the end of the day, is really, really important. And the things that are finally starting to happen, we need more of it, but it's no longer talk, it's concrete action. And I think that's the most important positive aspect of where we are on this Arctic inflection point right now.
Thank you very much, Senator. I very much appreciate it and wish you the very best back there in DC. Thank you again for joining us. And I want to thank everybody online for joining us for this over 1 hour packed discussion. Senator, thank you very much. And I thank you all for watching today. Have a good day.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, we'll see you. Thank you.